Puritans, a group of English Protestants from the 16th to 18th centuries who thought the Anglican Church hadn't really broken away from its Catholic roots. They wanted to purify the Church, getting rid of all those Catholic traditions they felt didn't belong. Now here's an interesting twist. The term Puritan wasn't exactly a badge of honor at the time. Anglicans actually used it as an insult, mocking these reformers as overly sensitive or uptight for being picky about religious details. The Puritans themselves never called themselves that. They preferred to think of themselves as saints. They were deeply inspired by John Calvin, a big name in the Protestant Reformation, and they took his teaching seriously. At first, the Puritans were a small group, but by the late 1500s and early 1600s, their movement was growing. They rejected things like the Book of Common Prayer and the structure of the Anglican Church because they felt it was too close to Catholic traditions. They even opposed simple things like incense, music, and ceremonies that they felt distracted from true worship. Queen Elizabeth I, for the most part, allowed them to do their thing, but when King James I came to power, the Puritans faced serious backlash. Now picture the Mayflower, the ship that carried some of these Puritans to North America in 1620. Half of those on board were Puritan separatists, a hardcore faction who believed the Anglican Church was beyond saving and that the only option was to start fresh, away from the persecutions of England. These separatists founded Plymouth Colony, and soon after, more Puritans, who weren't necessarily separatists but shared similar beliefs, also set sail to create colonies in America where they could practice their faith freely. Back in England, Puritanism was more than just a religious movement. It became a political force. By the mid-1600s, Puritans held enough sway to influence two civil wars, which eventually led to the creation of the Commonwealth and the Protectorate. But after the monarchy returned in 1660, their political influence began to fade in England. Over in North America, though, Puritan values thrived well into the 1700s. They shaped not only the church but also the politics and society of many of the original 13 colonies along the East Coast, with a lasting impact on American culture that can still be felt, especially in New England. The roots of Puritanism can be traced back to the Protestant Reformation, which split from the Catholic Church and spread throughout Europe. John Calvin, a Swiss theologian, was one of the key figures, advocating for a literal interpretation of the Bible and a disciplined lifestyle. Meanwhile, in England, King Henry VIII broke away from Catholicism and formed the Anglican Church, though he modeled it closely on the familiar structure of the Catholic Church. This didn't sit well with a small group of Protestants who expected a more radical change, and they began pushing for further reform. These were the people who eventually got labeled as Puritans, a nickname Anglicans used to poke fun at them as overly rigid or prudish. But the Puritans weren't just concerned with church practices, they also wanted to reform society itself. They opposed celebrations like Christmas, and they were strongly against popular entertainments of the time, like bear baiting, dog fights, and the theater, which they viewed as morally questionable due to its association with the city's seedier side, like brothels. They wanted a simpler, purer way of life, rooted in their beliefs and a literal reading of the Bible. And after Henry VIII, his son Edward VI took the throne, and he was way more invested in reshaping the Anglican Church than his father had ever been. Edward leaned toward Calvinist views, and during his rule, many clergy were influenced by these ideas, steering the church further away from Catholic traditions. But then came Mary I, known as Bloody Mary, who reversed all of Edward's changes, determined to bring England back to Catholicism. She didn't hold back in enforcing her beliefs, launching what's now called the Marian persecutions, during which many Protestants were burned at the stake. Puritans who could afford it fled England, later becoming known as Marian exiles. When Mary passed, her half-sister Elizabeth I took the throne and re-established Protestantism, bringing back the Anglican Church with her at its head. Her religious policy, the Elizabethan religious settlement of 1539, was meant to strike a balance, allowing for some compromise between more moderate Anglicans and Puritan-leaning Calvinists. However, those Marian exiles who had returned to England weren't happy with these compromises. They had seen Protestant movements in other parts of Europe, like France and Germany, go further in distancing themselves from Catholic practices. They wanted the English Church to adopt a more congregational model, with self-governing congregations instead of bishops. Tensions mounted, and many Puritans started to secretly oppose the Anglican Church and even Queen Elizabeth herself. This conflict eventually erupted in the late 1580s with a series of writings known as the Prelate controversy. An anonymous Puritan pamphleteer who went by Martin Prelate published a set of tracts that fiercely criticized the Queen, the Anglican Church, and specific bishops and priests. The government launched a full-scale manhunt to find Prelate, while Elizabeth's own writers released responses countering his arguments. Though Prelate himself was never caught, the authorities managed to track down and destroy his printing presses and distribution network. As a result, laws were established making it treason to criticize the Church, effectively consolidating the Anglican Church's authority. When James I succeeded Elizabeth in 1603, he attempted to calm the religious tensions by calling the Hampton Court Conference in 1604, a meeting between Puritan theologians and Anglican leaders. But after listening to both sides, James firmly rejected the Puritan agenda. To further cement his stance, he commissioned the King James Bible, hoping to create a version that aligned more closely with his own and the Anglican Church's views, rather than the Puritans' Geneva Bible, which was influenced by Calvinism. James also authorized church officers to work with the government to persecute Puritans, leading to fines, imprisonment, and even executions. Puritans stood firm, believing that their lives should be as close to the teachings of Jesus and his disciples as possible. To them, any religious practice that wasn't directly supported by the Bible had to be avoided. They were especially against Anglican practices like the use of bishops, the Book of Common Prayer, and the wearing of priestly vestments, all of which they saw as remnants of Catholicism. For Puritans, religion wasn't just a belief system, it was the ultimate guiding force in their lives, even if that meant facing persecution. A huge part of their belief system was something called covenant theology, a concept that framed their relationship with God as a sort of contract. They believed that if they lived according to God's will, as set out in the Bible, God would reward them. Yet they also believed in predestination, meaning they couldn't be sure of their own salvation, as only God knew who was truly saved. This made them all the more devoted, as they strove to live as one of God's chosen elect. Another key part of Puritan life was their strict observance of the Sabbath, where they focused solely on worship and refrained from work or leisure activities. The pulpit, where sermons were delivered, was the heart of their worship, as they believed faith came from hearing God's word. They taught boys to be hardworking and girls to be homemakers, while both were encouraged to read so they could study the Bible on their own. Puritans had strict views on entertainment and behavior. They avoided theaters, games of chance, and any kind of gambling, while alcohol was acceptable only in moderation. Sex was seen as a positive part of marriage, where both partners were expected to fulfill each other's needs. Women were seen as spiritually weaker, tainted by the legacy of Eve from the Bible, but they were respected as homemakers and mothers. With such strict values, it's no surprise that the Puritans clashed with James I and many in the Anglican Church. While moderate Puritans held roles within the Church, the more radical ones, called separatists, broke away entirely to form their own secret congregations. Since these gatherings were illegal, those caught were often punished. And so, the stage was set for Puritans to seek a new place where they could live out their beliefs without interference. As tensions in England escalated, Puritans increasingly sought places with greater religious freedom. Many of them began secretly leaving England for the Netherlands, where tolerance was more common. In 1607, a Puritan congregation from Scrooby, England, was uncovered by the Anglican Archbishop Tobias Matthew, who arrested and fined its members. Their leader, Pastor John Robinson, decided it was time to follow others who had already gone to the Netherlands. The group settled first in Amsterdam, but internal disagreements among the Puritan communities there soon led them to relocate to Leiden, where they found a more cohesive environment. Meanwhile, Puritans continued to challenge the Anglican Church through underground publications, despite the crackdown on pamphlets from the Merprelate controversy years earlier. One of the Leiden congregation's members, William Brewster, even managed to smuggle an anti-Anglican tract into England in 1618. When King James I heard of it, he ordered Brewster's arrest. This intensified the congregation's resolve to find a new haven. By then, England had already attempted to establish settlements in North America, with Jamestown, Virginia, as its only successful colony. Inspired by this, Robinson's group decided to establish a new settlement themselves, one where they could worship freely and build a community aligned with their beliefs. In 1620, they set sail on the Mayflower, bound for the New World. They faced a brutal first winter, losing nearly half of their group to disease and harsh conditions. Despite this, they managed to establish the Plymouth colony, which thrived and quickly attracted attention back in England. In 1622, two colonists, William Bradford and Edward Winslow, published Mort's Relation, describing Plymouth as a promising new land. The colony's success inspired others, and soon Puritans began immigrating in what's now called the Great Migration. Between 1620 and 1640, more than 20,000 Puritans left England for New England, establishing a strong Puritan presence in Massachusetts. In 1630, a fleet carrying 700 Puritans, led by John Winthrop, arrived to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony near Boston. Winthrop envisioned this new settlement as a city on a hill, a model of Christian living that could inspire others. Although the Puritans had come to North America to freely practice their beliefs, they didn't extend the same tolerance to others. The Massachusetts Bay Colony wasn't an outright theocracy, but Puritan values heavily influenced its governance. Citizens were expected to follow strict codes of conduct as defined by Puritan beliefs. Native Americans were seen as in need of salvation, so missionaries were sent to convert them, creating communities of so-called praying Indians. However, these converts often faced exclusion from both their own people and the Puritan settlers. The Puritans viewed other faiths, particularly Quakers, Catholics, Jews, and even Anglicans, with suspicion. Quakers, who believed everyone had a spark of divine light, were especially despised since this belief challenged the Puritan view that only the elect were truly chosen by God. This Puritan intolerance even led to further migrations by groups who sought more religious freedom, some moving to Rhode Island, Connecticut, and other nearby areas. Many of these regions adopted ideas from the Mayflower Compact, the founding document of Plymouth's government, as they created their own. The Puritans' influence on American culture is far-reaching. They valued literacy as essential for understanding God's Word, so education was highly prioritized. Harvard University was founded by Massachusetts Bay Colony Puritans in 1636 to train clergy, and they also promoted medical knowledge. Strict Sabbath observance led to the establishment of blue laws, which still impact laws in some states today. Their influence extended to things like Christmas, which went uncelebrated in the United States until 1870 because the Puritans rejected it as unbiblical. While the Puritans held a strict, disciplined lifestyle, their views included racism and sexism. They saw Africans, Native Americans, and women as particularly vulnerable to Satan. Women, in particular, were considered spiritually weak and susceptible to sin. This belief underpinned many of the infamous witch trials, including those in Salem, Massachusetts, and other New England towns. The Puritans also participated in the slave trade, selling captured Native Americans and importing African slaves, especially after conflicts like the Pequot Wars. Back in England, Puritans continued pushing for reform within the Anglican Church, which led to broader political conflicts that influenced the English Civil Wars. Ultimately, their efforts contributed to the Commonwealth's establishment, the execution of King Charles I, and the rise of the Puritan leader Oliver Cromwell. However, after Cromwell's death and the monarchy's restoration in 1660, Puritans in England lost much of their political power. In North America, Puritan influence gradually waned as religious diversity grew, but their impact is still felt, especially in concepts like American exceptionalism, the belief that the United States holds a unique place among nations. This idea was championed by early Puritan leaders like Bradford and Winthrop, and later popularized in American thought throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries.